It was the most produced fighter aircraft in history. It created the highest scoring aces the world has ever known and destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other fighter ever built. Yet behind these numbers lies a quieter statistic, one rarely spoken aloud. Nearly 9 out of 10 pilots who flew it would not survive the war. This is not a story of engineering triumph alone. It is a story about how speed, ambition, and ideology fused into a machine that consumed the very men meant to master it, and why the legacy of that machine still echoes far beyond the end of World War II. Stay with us as we strip away the myth and expose what the Messerschmitt Bf 109 truly cost. In the years following the First World War, Germany was a defeated nation bound by paper and ink. The Treaty of Versailles reduced its military to a shadow of its former self, limiting the army to 100,000 men and banning the development of modern weapons. Aviation was singled out as a particular threat. Germany was forbidden from producing or importing military aircraft, engines, or even spare parts. Every existing military plane had to be surrendered and destroyed. On the surface, German military aviation ceased to exist. In reality, it went underground. The country's aviation industry survived by wearing a civilian mask, operating airlines and aircraft that officially served peaceful purposes. Behind closed doors, these same organizations preserved knowledge, personnel, and industrial capability. What appeared to be civil aviation was, in practice, a rehearsal for war. The national airline trained pilots on aircraft deliberately similar to future military designs. These men learned navigation, formation flying, and high-performance handling, skills that could be transferred almost instantly to combat roles. Engineers refined airframes, engines, and manufacturing methods under the guise of civilian progress. Germany was not rebuilding an air force openly. It was hiding one in plain sight. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in January 1933, they inherited far more than a broken nation. They inherited a concealed foundation of air power ready to be exposed. Within weeks, rearmament began accelerating, no longer cautiously, but with open defiance. The Treaty of Versailles was no longer a constraint. It was an obstacle to be discarded. On March 1st, Germany officially established its new air force and publicly renounced the treaty's restrictions. To the outside world, this moment was a shock. To Germany's aviation industry, it was simply permission to stop pretending. Plans that had existed only on drafting tables could now become metal and rivets. Among the priorities of the new Air Force was a radical shift in fighter design. The biplanes that had dominated the skies of the First World War were obsolete. What was needed was a single-engine fighter that could outrun, outclimb, and outfight anything currently flying. Speed and firepower were no longer luxuries. They were necessities. The requirement was ruthless in its simplicity. Design the smallest possible airframe. Wrap it around the most powerful engine available. Arm it well enough to destroy enemy aircraft quickly. Every unnecessary kilogram was to be eliminated. The aircraft that emerged from this philosophy was designed by Willy Messerschmitt. Its shape alone signaled a break from the past. A low-wing monoplane, compact and aggressive, with no room for excess. It looked unlike anything in service anywhere in the world. There was irony even in its first flight. German engines intended to power the aircraft were not yet ready, so the earliest prototypes flew using British Rolls-Royce Kestrel engines, quietly acquired through indirect means. Germany's future fighter took to the air powered by the technology of the very nations it would soon face in combat. The first prototype flew just 2 months after the Luftwaffe was officially announced. The message was unmistakable. Germany was not merely rearming, it was leaping ahead. To understand the shock this aircraft created, one must understand the context of the early 1930s. Most fighter aircraft were still refinements of First World War designs. Fabric-covered biplanes dominated the skies. They had fixed landing gear, open cockpits, and relatively weak engines. They were evolutionary, not revolutionary. Even aircraft considered modern carried clear limitations. The American Boeing P-26, introduced in 1934, was a monoplane, yet still had fixed landing gear and an open cockpit. British fighters like the Gloucester Gladiator and Hawker Fury remained biplanes. Change was slow and cautious. The new German fighter shattered that caution. It was an all-metal monocoque design, meaning its skin carried structural loads rather than fabric stretched over a frame. This allowed for a lighter, stronger airframe. The cockpit was fully enclosed, reducing drag and improving pilot endurance. The landing gear retracted into the fuselage, further enhancing aerodynamic efficiency. Power came from a liquid-cooled, inverted V12 engine. This configuration allowed a streamlined nose and improved pilot visibility. Automatic leading-edge slats on the wings improved low-speed handling and reduced the risk of stalling during tight maneuvers. Takeoffs were shorter. Climbs were steeper. The pilot's seating position was slightly reclined. This subtle detail had serious implications. It may have allowed pilots to tolerate higher G-forces by slowing the movement of blood away from the brain. In combat, seconds mattered. So did consciousness. Together, these features placed the aircraft years ahead of its contemporaries. It was not just a new fighter, it was the blueprint for the future of aerial combat. Its initial armament was modest but precise. 2 machine guns were mounted above the engine, firing through the arc of the propeller using synchronization gear. This system prevented bullets from striking the propeller blades. The guns were close together, improving accuracy at longer ranges compared to wing-mounted weapons that required convergence. This configuration reflected the aircraft's philosophy: efficiency over excess, precision over volume. The world received its first public glimpse of this new fighter during the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games. 14 pilots performed aerial displays, showcasing speeds and maneuvers unseen by most spectators. It was not merely entertainment. It was a message. Germany was announcing its return as a military power. The aircraft's performance stunned foreign observers. Behind the spectacle was a clear warning: the balance of air power in Europe was shifting. The following year, a specially modified version set a new world speed record for land-based aircraft, reaching 610 kilometers per hour. German propaganda seized on the achievement, implying that all of their fighters possessed such performance. Reality mattered less than perception, and perception now worked in Germany's favor. By the late 1930s, while other nations were still debating design philosophies, Germany had already committed to a future defined by speed, power, and aggression. The aircraft that embodied this future would soon be tested not in demonstrations, but in war. When the aircraft entered service, it did not simply outperform its rivals. It exposed how outdated the rest of the world's fighter fleets truly were. Pilots transitioning from biplanes suddenly found themselves flying faster than many bombers could escape. Climb rates, acceleration, and dive speed gave them control over when and how combat happened. But this leap forward carried hidden costs that would only become apparent with time. One of the most dangerous flaws was already built into the airframe. The landing gear, unlike most fighters, was mounted directly to the fuselage rather than the wings. This allowed for easier manufacturing and a cleaner aerodynamic profile. However, it placed the wheels very close together. On the ground, the aircraft became unstable, unforgiving, and lethal to mistakes. During takeoff, as speed increased and the tail lifted, torque from the propeller could cause the aircraft to swing violently to the left. If the pilot failed to correct this perfectly, there was no recovery. Once the aircraft began to veer, physics took over. The narrow undercarriage collapsed. The wing struck the ground, and the fighter was destroyed in seconds. This was not a rare occurrence. It happened repeatedly, even to experienced pilots. Over the course of the war, roughly 1,700 of these fighters were lost to undercarriage accidents alone. An estimated 10% of all aircraft produced were destroyed during takeoff or landing. During training, around 1,700 Luftwaffe pilots were killed in non-combat accidents. The enemy did not shoot them down. Their own aircraft did. This flaw would never be fully corrected. Design changes improved performance in the air, but the landing gear geometry remained largely the same. Speed had been prioritized. Safety had not. Despite this, the aircraft's combat debut seemed to justify every risk. In early 1937, the B variant arrived in Spain. Germany used the Spanish Civil War as a testing ground for weapons, tactics, and doctrine. The new fighter was one of the most closely observed tools in this experiment. Opposing it were Soviet-supplied fighters that, on paper, were considered capable. In practice, they were outmatched. The German fighter climbed faster, dived faster, and retained energy better in combat. Pilots quickly learned how to exploit these advantages. The results were decisive. By the time the Spanish Civil War ended in April 1939, the aircraft had established itself as the most effective fighter in the world. German pilots gained invaluable combat experience. Equally important, engineers gained real data from real combat. Production variants evolved rapidly. Early B models gave way to the C and D variants. By December 1938, the first E models entered service, powered by a far more powerful Daimler-Benz engine, producing around 1,000 horsepower. Firepower increased. Speed increased. Confidence increased. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was still catching up. Britain's Hurricane and Spitfire had flown, but had only recently entered squadron service. France relied on aging designs. The United States remained years behind, with modern fighters arriving only at the very end of the decade. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, it possessed roughly 1,000 of these fighters. Around 850 were the latest E model. Poland fell in a month. Air superiority had been achieved almost immediately. The same pattern followed in the invasion of France. In the air, the German fighter outclassed nearly everything it encountered. By May 1940, however, a new opponent appeared. Over the skies of Western Europe, it met the British Spitfire for the first time. For the first time, the balance was not one-sided. The Spitfire could outturn and outmaneuver the German fighter. The German aircraft, in return, could outclimb and outdive its opponent. Victory increasingly depended not on the machine alone, but on the pilot inside it. There was one technical advantage that proved decisive in many encounters. The German engine used fuel injection instead of a float carburetor. This allowed pilots to perform negative G maneuvers without cutting fuel flow. British fighters could not. When a British pilot pushed into a dive, the engine would briefly stall. German pilots learned to exploit this weakness instantly. They would dive away, knowing their opponents could not immediately follow. At this stage, the aircraft still appeared nearly flawless. It dominated early battlefields. It produced rising aces. But the war was about to change, and the aircraft was about to be forced into a role it had never been designed to fulfill. By the summer of 1940, Western Europe lay under German occupation. Airfields across France and the Low Countries were rapidly expanded and prepared. More than 2,500 German aircraft stood ready for what would become the decisive test of air power over Europe. This was the opening phase of the Battle of Britain. For the first time, the fighter was asked to do something it had never been designed for. It was not built as a long-range escort. It was built as a short-range interceptor, meant to rise quickly, strike hard, and land close to home. Now it had to cross the English Channel, escort bombers deep into hostile airspace, fight prolonged engagements, and still make it back. To survive this new role, changes were made. Armor plating was added to protect the pilot. Drop tanks were introduced to extend range. Every modification added weight. Every kilogram reduced agility. Even with these changes, the limits were severe. The fighter's combat radius was roughly 400 kilometers. When escorting bombers from bases in France, pilots had fuel for barely 15 minutes of actual combat over England. After that, they had to turn back or risk never returning. Time and again, pilots were forced to abandon bombers in the middle of battle, not because they were losing, but because fuel gauges dictated their survival. Some tried to stay longer. Many never made it home. Dozens crashed into the English Channel after running out of fuel. The sea claimed them quietly, without witnesses, without glory. These losses rarely appeared in victory reports, but they accumulated all the same. The British held an advantage that could not be engineered away. Radar. Incoming German raids were detected more than 100 miles from the coast. Fighter Command had time to scramble interceptors, position squadrons, and choose when to engage. German pilots arrived over England already at a disadvantage. Low on fuel, deep in enemy territory, facing defenders with full tanks, ground control guidance, and the motivation of fighting over their own homes. Anti-aircraft fire added another layer of danger. Even aircraft that survived combat often returned damaged. For a machine as fragile as this fighter, damage was often a death sentence delayed by minutes. When the battle ended in late October 1940, the outcome was undeniable. Germany had lost over 1,700 aircraft. Around 600 of them were these fighters. The myth of effortless dominance had been broken. But to truly understand what these losses meant, one has to understand what it was like to fly this aircraft. Unlike later fighters powered by air-cooled radial engines, this machine relied on a liquid-cooled inline engine. The principle was simple. So were its vulnerabilities. A single bullet could puncture a coolant line. Another could hit the radiator. Oil leaks, fuel leaks, or a cracked engine block meant the same thing. The engine would overheat or seize. Power would vanish. At that point, the pilot was no longer fighting. He was gliding, searching for a field or water. Compared to later radial engine fighters which could absorb damage and still limp home, this aircraft was unforgiving. It had little armor. Aside from some bullet-resistant glass and limited plating around the cockpit, it was no tougher than a civilian automobile. Speed and maneuverability were its only real protection. The cockpit reflected the same philosophy. It was cramped, narrow, designed around the airframe, not the pilot. Allied pilots later described it as exhausting to fly. Visibility was limited. Comfort had been sacrificed completely. Survival depended on awareness, reflexes, and luck was something that ran out quickly. The spring of 1941 brought a strange and unsettling episode. Years earlier, Germany had sold around 70 of these fighters to Yugoslavia. When Germany invaded in April, Yugoslav pilots took to the air in the very aircraft they had purchased from their attacker. For 11 days, identical fighters clashed in the sky. On the first day alone, Yugoslav pilots claimed 7 German fighters while losing 5 of their own. Confusion reigned. From the ground, Yugoslav anti-aircraft crews struggled to identify friend from foe. On several occasions, they fired on their own aircraft. The chaos revealed a grim truth. Technology meant little when war erased clarity. As the conflict expanded south, the fighter followed. In North Africa and the Middle East, it was modified with sand filters to cope with dust and debris. These tropicalized versions performed well, but heat and harsh terrain created new stresses. Engines overheated. Maintenance became a constant struggle. Then, in June 1941, the war widened again. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The opening assault was supported by 450 of these fighters. A new variant entered service. This was the Friedrich. Refined, streamlined, improved based on every lesson learned so far. The nose was cleaner, the propeller spinner larger, the engine cowling redesigned. Rounded wingtips improved aerodynamics. Wing-mounted cannons were removed entirely. All armament was concentrated in the nose. 2 synchronized machine guns above the engine. A single cannon firing through the hollow propeller hub. The motor cannon arrangement. For experienced pilots, this was the finest version ever built. Accuracy improved. Handling improved. Firepower was devastating. The cannon fired high explosive mine shells with thin walls and a large explosive charge. A single hit could tear apart an enemy aircraft. Against poorly organized Soviet air forces flying outdated designs, the results were catastrophic. On the Eastern Front, German pilots claimed over 4,000 enemy aircraft for the loss of roughly 150 of their own. Victory numbers soared. Aces were born at an unprecedented rate, but beneath the surface, the same pattern was forming. Extraordinary success built on a system that consumed pilots faster than it could replace them. And the war was far from over. In the spring of 1942, the aircraft entered a new phase of its life. The Friedrich was replaced by the Gustav. On paper, it was a major step forward. In reality, it marked the beginning of a slow internal collapse. The new variant was powered by a more powerful Daimler-Benz engine, producing close to 1,500 horsepower. Firepower increased again. Heavier machine guns were installed. Cannon options multiplied. The aircraft was now expected to destroy 4 engine bombers, not just enemy fighters. It became the most widely produced version of the aircraft. More than 12,000 were built. Factories worked around the clock. Quantity became the priority. Quality did not keep pace. As Germany's industrial situation worsened, metallurgy suffered. Critical components such as exhaust valves failed at alarming rates. Engines broke down without warning. Oil leaks became common. Some early Gustav models delivered to frontline units caught fire in flight. The cause was simple and terrifying. Oil tanks mounted in the nose began leaking onto hot engine components. Pilots had seconds to react. The aircraft that once felt like an extension of the pilot now felt unpredictable. Experienced pilots noticed the change immediately. Some refused to fly the new version unless ordered. One of them was Hans Joachim Marseille, the highest-scoring ace against Western Allied air forces. He had achieved 158 confirmed victories. He trusted the earlier versions of the aircraft. He did not trust the Gustav. He was eventually ordered to transition. Not long after, while returning from a mission after scoring multiple victories, his cockpit suddenly filled with thick black smoke. The engine was failing. Wingmen guided him toward friendly territory. He prepared to bail out, but the aircraft was already diving steeply at over 600 kilometers per hour. Here, another fatal flaw revealed itself. The aircraft's canopy did not slide back like most fighters. It was hinged to the side. At high speed, airflow made opening it impossible. Pilots had to jettison the canopy entirely, then roll the aircraft inverted, then fall out. In the smoke, disoriented and blinded, Marseille did not realize how fast he was diving. As he exited the cockpit, the slipstream slammed him backward. He struck the vertical stabilizer with his chest. He was either killed instantly or knocked unconscious. His parachute never opened. His wingmen watched him fall. This was not an isolated tragedy. It was a mechanical death trap waiting for the wrong moment. There was another reason German pilots achieved such extraordinary kill counts. Unlike their Allied counterparts, they were never rotated out of combat. There was no system to pull experienced pilots back to train new ones. There was no rest. Germany faced a constant shortage of trained fighter pilots from the very beginning. Every available man was needed at the front. Pilots flew until they were killed, captured, or too badly wounded to continue. Even injury was often temporary. Once deemed fit enough, pilots were sent back into combat. Some squadrons lost more than 100% of their pilots. The entire roster was killed, replaced, and the replacements were killed as well. Experience accumulated at the top. Losses accumulated everywhere else. By 1943, the role of the aircraft changed completely. American and British air forces launched a sustained bombing campaign against German industry. Factories, infrastructure, and aircraft production itself became targets. The Luftwaffe was now fighting for survival. Early in the campaign, Allied bombers suffered horrific losses. They flew deep into enemy territory beyond the range of escort fighters. They relied on defensive guns and tight formation flying. German fighters waited for this moment. They scrambled when escorts turned back. They attacked bombers in concentrated waves. But shooting down a heavy bomber was nothing like fighting a fighter. Bombers were armed. They flew in defensive formations. They could absorb damage. Aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress shot down a significant number of German fighters. Pilots knew the risk, but orders did not change. The standard armament of the aircraft was no longer enough, so it was overloaded. Underwing gun pods were added. Two 20mm cannons, later even 30mm cannons, were mounted in gondolas beneath the wings. Each carried heavy ammunition loads. The result was drag, imbalance, a loss of agility. The aircraft began to fly like a pendulum. Dogfighting ability disappeared, but bomber-killing power increased. There were even experiments with heavy air-to-air rockets designed to be fired into bomber formations from a distance. They worked, but they pushed the aircraft further from what it had once been. Then came the moment that ended everything. The Allies solved the range problem. Drop tank technology, long available but poorly used, was refined and perfected. When paired with a new fighter powered by the same Merlin engine used in British aircraft, it changed the war. The P-51 Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It had fuel for combat, and when drop tanks were jettisoned, it had speed and agility. Suddenly, there were no safe skies. German fighters were attacked while climbing, while landing, while parked on the ground. Overloaded aircraft faced fresh enemy fighters with full performance. Young German pilots, barely trained, met experienced Allied pilots in modern machines. The skies over Germany became a slaughterhouse. Factories were sabotaged from within by forced laborers. Loose bolts, foreign objects in fuel tanks, clogged oil lines. Even the aircraft that made it to the runway could not be trusted. In the final months of the war, desperation replaced strategy. A special volunteer unit was formed, Sonderkommando Elbe. About 300 pilots flew stripped-down fighters with minimal armor and armament. Their mission was to ram bombers out of the sky. They could withdraw an hour before takeoff. No records exist of anyone doing so. They aimed for cockpits and tails. In one mission alone, 8 bombers were destroyed by ramming. In one recorded case, a pilot rammed a B-24 head-on. The bomber collided with another aircraft. Both crashed. The pilot survived by bailing out with a broken collarbone. It was the end. By the final phase of the war, Allied air superiority was complete. A saying spread among soldiers: if you see a silver plane, it is American. If you see a green plane, it is British. If you see no plane at all, it is German. As for the aircraft itself, it left behind numbers without context. Over 33,000 were built, more than 13,000 in 1944 alone. Around 30,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. It created the highest scoring aces in history. Hundreds achieved over 100 victories. Some flew until 1965, but behind every statistic was the same truth. 90% of the fighter pilots Germany sent into the war did not live to see its end. This aircraft was not just a weapon. It was a system, and systems do not care who they consume. After the war ended, the aircraft did not vanish with the regime that created it. Captured examples were flown, tested, and studied by former enemies. Some were rebuilt, repainted, and pressed back into service by smaller air forces with limited resources. The machine outlived the ideology that shaped it. Its long operational life became part of the legend. Serving in various nations until the mid-1960s, it earned the title of the longest-serving fighter aircraft in history. 9 major variants, nearly 80 subvariants, a decade of constant modification. From a technical perspective, it was a triumph of iterative design. Engineers extracted more power from the same airframe year after year. Firepower increased. Performance improved. Limits were pushed far beyond what the original designers could have imagined. But those achievements obscure a darker reality. The aircraft was never allowed to rest. It was never replaced in time. It was asked to fight wars. It was not built to win. As Germany's situation deteriorated, the fighter became a symbol of decline rather than dominance. It flew heavier. It flew slower. It flew with less experienced pilots. The qualities that once made it lethal became liabilities. The aces it produced were not proof of a superior system. They were proof of its brutality. Victory totals climbed because pilots were never withdrawn. Survival rates fell for the same reason. In the end, the aircraft's legacy cannot be measured only in numbers, not in production totals, not in kill counts, not in records. Its true legacy is the reminder that technological brilliance, when driven by ideology and desperation, can become indifferent to human life. That speed and power do not equal sustainability, and that a weapon can win battles while losing the future. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was never just a fighter aircraft. It was a mirror, reflecting the rise, the arrogance, and the collapse of the system that built it. And long after the engines fell silent, that reflection remained. There is no final victory scene for this story, no moment where the machine redeems itself, only an accounting. A fighter that defined an era of air combat, a design that changed how wars were fought in the sky, and a system that burned through men faster than it could train them. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 did exactly what it was built to do. It killed efficiently. It evolved relentlessly. It stayed in service long after it should have been replaced. What it could not do was protect those who flew it, not from mechanical failure, not from exhaustion, not from a war that demanded everything and gave nothing back. In the end, the aircraft's greatest achievement was also its greatest warning. That success measured only in numbers can hide catastrophic human loss, and that history's most effective weapons are often the most unforgiving. This is why the story of the Bf 109 is not just aviation history. It is a lesson written in aluminum, fuel, and blood. By the time the guns fell silent, the sky over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. The aircraft that once symbolized speed and dominance had been pushed beyond its limits, stretched across too many fronts, flown by too few survivors. It did not fail suddenly. It eroded mission by mission, pilot by pilot. What remained after 1945 was not a legend, but a record of how innovation can outrun restraint, of how a weapon optimized for victory can become blind to cost, of how an entire generation of pilots was consumed to keep a system alive just a little longer. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 is remembered as the most produced fighter in history, as the deadliest in terms of aerial victories, as the aircraft of the highest scoring aces. Those facts are all true, but they are incomplete. Because behind every statistic stands the same unanswered question. How many lives does a machine have to destroy before its success becomes indistinguishable from failure? That question did not end with the war. It did not end with this aircraft. And it is the reason this story still matters today. History often remembers machines for what they accomplished, rarely for what they consumed. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 accomplished exactly what it was designed to do again and again until there was nothing left to give. It began as a leap into the future, a fighter that broke with the past and forced the world to catch up. But it ended as a relic still fighting because there was nothing to replace it. Not because it was perfect, but because the system behind it had collapsed. By the final year of the war, the aircraft no longer symbolized innovation. It symbolized exhaustion. Factories built it faster as quality fell. Pilots flew it younger, with less training, into increasingly hopeless battles. The sky that once belonged to it became hostile everywhere. There were no safe routes, no uncontested airspace, no margin for error, and when it was finally gone, nothing replaced the men who died inside it. No record balanced that loss. No victory justified it. This is why the story of the Bf 109 endures, not as a tale of glory, but as a warning, because history does not repeat itself through machines. It repeats itself through decisions. In the end, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 did not disappear in flames or defeat. It faded out, scattered across airfields, museums, and forgotten runways. Some were captured, some were reused. Most were simply left behind as the world moved on. Its numbers remain unmatched. More than 33,000 built, around 30,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, a record no fighter has ever surpassed. But numbers are easy to preserve. Lives are not. 90% of the fighter pilots Germany committed to the war did not survive it. They were not all aces. They were not all volunteers. Many were barely trained, sent up because there was no one else left. The Bf-109 did not cause this alone, but it became the vessel through which it happened. A machine optimized for performance, not endurance. For results, not sustainability. That is why this story still matters. Because the danger was never the aircraft itself. It was the belief that efficiency could replace humanity. That innovation could excuse attrition. That systems matter more than the people trapped inside them. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 stands as proof that a weapon can dominate the battlefield and still represent failure. Not a failure of engineering, but a failure of judgment. And history, when stripped of myth, remembers that distinction.